So now we're in chapter 3 of St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. Chapter 1 talked about the glory of the cross and how St. Paul was proud to preach that. And then in chapter 2, it was about the wisdom of God, how God's plan to send his son to be the sacrificial lamb for our sins was part of his divine wisdom, even though it's not human wisdom. Like, human beings wouldn't have thought of a plan like that, which is why many didn't accept Jesus and many didn't accept the cross, because it's not the human way of thinking. But now as we enter chapter 3, St. Paul now directs his attention to the conduct of the people, beginning with this talk about giving food to infants. So most of you have been mothers out here at some point, except for Joe here. Joe is the father. Angie did all the hard work there. When you have infants, you give them milk first. You don't give them steak. You don't give them the solid food. You start off small. And St. Paul's saying, when I first met you, I gave you milk. I treated you as infants. You were young, you're new. But this letter is about 2 or 3 years after St. Paul has first preached the gospel to him, and he expected some growth. He didn't get it. They remained babies. And how does he know this? Well, because of the division, the rivalry. Remember, that was one of the issues with the Corinthians. A lot of division among them, breaking up into factions. And we even hear a little bit about that today, where it was customary at the time in the Greek-Roman culture to have what's called a client-patron relationship, where you had the few elite up on the top, and then you had a lot of the servants and the peasants on the bottom, and the peasants would leech on to one of the elites where they would perform services for them. In exchange, the elite would make sure they're protected. That was the Greek and Roman culture around them. You had those relationships between the elite and the peasants. And you see that today in the first reading, in the spiritual sense. I belong to Apollos. I belong to Paul. Mimicking that patron-client relationship. Some attaching themselves to Paul without Paul's consent and without Apollos' consent. And so they're attaching themselves to them. And then there's going to be division when there's conflict, division among them. And so St. Paul goes into his little catechesis. What is Apollos? What is Paul? They're just servants. They're just servants themselves of the gospel message. They planted, they watered, but God does the growth. It doesn't matter who you belong to, quote unquote. The only one that you should belong to is to God and to Jesus Christ, the Lord, the King of Kings. He's the one that's going to grow you spiritually from infants into maturity. But like the Corinthians and like us, sometimes we don't progress. Sometimes we just kind of remain in our state. Sometimes we digress. We go back to our ways. I think that happens to us a lot. Up and down, But I always got to remember that it's God who's doing the growing in our lives. It's God who's coming in and God who's drawing us close to himself. So always remember that. It's easy for us to fall into divisions. Part of our inclination to sin is to divide ourselves and to classify ourselves. But we're all one under Christ, who's going to grow us from infants to full spiritual maturity. May God bless you.